Imagine walking into a place where nothing about your past matters. No reputation. No recognition. No advantage. Just presence. The kind of place where people don't ask who you are. They decide what you are. And sometimes they test it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But quietly, with intention. Across the room, someone is already watching. Not curious. Not friendly. Measuring. Because in environments like this, there's an unspoken rule. Everyone gets assessed. Not by what they say, but by how they respond. Now here's the question. What happens when someone who expects a reaction gets nothing? No fear. No ego. No resistance. Just stillness. That's where things begin to shift. Because most people understand confrontation. Raised voices. Fast movements. Clear outcomes. But very few understand composure. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't try to dominate. The kind that simply exists. And that's what makes it unpredictable. Because when pressure meets calm, it doesn't always create conflict. Sometimes, it creates confusion. And confusion is uncomfortable. Especially for someone who's used to control. So they step closer. Not to attack. Not yet. But to see. To test the boundary. To find a crack in the silence. But what if there isn't one? What if the person standing there isn't trying to win anything? What if they're not playing the same game at all? That's the moment most people misunderstand. Because they expect escalation. They expect a reaction. They expect something visible. But instead, they get restraint. Measured breathing. Unbroken focus. A presence that doesn't move. Even when everything around it does. And suddenly the situation isn't simple anymore. Because this isn't about intimidation. It's about control. Not over others, but over self. And that changes everything. So now the real question becomes, when someone tries to apply pressure, and it doesn't work, who actually holds the power? And more importantly, what happens next? This isn't a story about conflict. It's about pressure. Because in certain environments, especially unfamiliar ones, people don't always test you with words. They don't need to. Presence alone becomes the language. A glance can be a question. A step forward can be a statement. And silence can mean more than anything spoken. In places like this, boundaries aren't explained. They're discovered, slowly, carefully, and sometimes deliberately. Because when people don't know you, they rely on instinct. They read posture, energy, awareness. The smallest reactions become signals. Hesitation can be misread as weakness. Overreaction can be seen as insecurity. And confidence, real confidence, often goes unnoticed at first. That's what makes these moments so interesting. They're not loud. They're not dramatic. But they reveal everything. Now think about someone like Keanu Reeves. Not as a celebrity. Not as someone known around the world. But simply as a person stepping into an environment where none of that matters. Because in this situation, it doesn't. What matters here is something else entirely. Control. Awareness. And the ability to remain grounded when attention shifts toward you. Reeves has often been associated with roles that require intense focus and discipline, especially in films like John Wick. But what's important isn't the action people see on screen. It's the preparation behind it. The repetition. The structure. The mental conditioning. Not for real combat, but for performance under pressure. And that distinction matters. Because what we're exploring here isn't about fighting ability. It's about composure. The kind that doesn't rely on physical strength. The kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that remains steady, even when tested. In high-pressure situations, most people operate on instinct. They react quickly. They mirror energy. They escalate without realizing it. But there's another approach. One that's quieter. Instead of reacting outwardly, it turns inward. Breathing slows. Focus sharpens. Awareness expands. And suddenly, the situation isn't something to win. It's something to understand. Because pressure often reveals more about the person applying it than the person receiving it. And that's where perception begins to shift. The individual creating tension expects a certain outcome. A reaction. A signal that confirms their read of the situation. But when that signal doesn't come, there's a pause. Not visible to everyone, but real. Because now uncertainty enters the space. And uncertainty changes behavior. This is the part most people overlook. They think strength is about asserting control over others. But in reality, it often begins with controlling your own response. Choosing not to react impulsively. Choosing not to match intensity with intensity. Choosing to stay present. That's not weakness. That's discipline. And discipline in moments like these becomes something powerful. Not because it dominates the situation, but because it stabilizes it. So now, instead of a predictable exchange, something else begins to unfold. A silent interaction. A shift in awareness. A subtle recalibration of space, energy, and intent. No words. No sudden movements. Just observation. And patience. Because when pressure doesn't create reaction, it creates something far more interesting. It creates a moment of truth. And what happens in that moment depends entirely on who understands it first. The room didn't change, but the atmosphere did. It became quieter, not in sound but in feeling. Like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only awareness behind. No one announced it. No one needed to. Because tension doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes, it settles in slowly. Like a weight you can't see, but you can feel. Across the space, the distance between two individuals began to matter more than anything else. Not far. Not close. Just enough to notice. One of them moved first. A small step. Not aggressive. Not rushed. Intentional. The kind of movement that isn't meant to start something, but to observe what happens next. And that's where most situations begin to escalate. Because movement invites response. It asks a question without speaking. Will you react? But this time, nothing happened. No shift backward. No defensive posture. No visible tension. Just stillness. And that stillness carried something unusual. Not hesitation. Not uncertainty. But control. The kind of control that doesn't tighten the body. It relaxes it. Breathing remains steady. Slow in. Slow out. Measured. Deliberate. While most people in moments like this begin to think ahead. Anticipating outcomes, preparing reactions. This presence stayed exactly where it was. Not in the future. Not in fear. Just here. And that changes the dynamic. Because when one person is trying to create pressure, and the other refuses to absorb it, the pressure has nowhere to go. It lingers. It builds. But it doesn't land. The observer, now slightly closer, paused. Not because anything had happened, but because nothing had. And that nothing was unexpected. Eye contact held. Not in challenge. Not in defiance. But in awareness. Clear. Unbroken. Calm. There was no attempt to dominate the moment. No effort to prove anything. And that, more than anything else, made it difficult to read. Because most people rely on signals. Signs of discomfort. Signs of readiness. Signs of emotion. But here, there were none. Only presence. And presence, when it's steady, becomes difficult to influence. Another subtle shift. A slight adjustment in angle. Not to close distance, but to change perspective. Testing again. Looking for reaction. Looking for something to confirm expectation. But again, nothing. No reaction doesn't mean nothing is happening. In fact, it often means the opposite. It means everything is being processed, internally. Every movement noticed. Every change understood. Every possibility acknowledged. But without urgency. Without tension. Just awareness. And that's where the imbalance begins. Because now, the one applying pressure starts to feel something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Not because of what the other person is doing, but because of what they're not doing. No escalation. No submission. No resistance. Just consistency. And consistency, under pressure, is rare. It can't be easily challenged. It can't be easily manipulated. And most importantly, it can't be easily understood. The space between them remained, unchanged in distance, but completely different in meaning. Because now it wasn't about testing anymore. It was about interpreting. Trying to make sense of something that didn't follow the usual pattern. And that's where tension reaches its peak. Not in action, but in anticipation. Because something is clearly happening, even if nothing visible has occurred. And in that moment, the situation stops being about control over space, and starts becoming about control over self. The question is no longer, who will act first? But instead, who truly understands what's happening here? Because the answer to that is what determines everything that follows. And then, something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, in a way most people would miss if they weren't paying attention. Because the shift didn't come from movement alone. It came from intention. Up until now, everything had been a test. Distance. Eye contact. Silence. Each moment carrying a question. Each pause waiting for an answer. But the answers never came in the form that was expected. There was no reaction to push against, no resistance to measure, no escalation to respond to. And when a pattern doesn't form, the mind starts searching for one. That's where the shift begins. A subtle adjustment, barely noticeable. A slight change in posture, shoulders relaxing instead of tightening. A redistribution of balance, grounded, stable, effortless. Not preparing for anything. Not avoiding anything. Just aligned. And alignment changes perception. Because now what once looked like neutrality starts to feel like control. Not control over the situation, but control within it. The kind that doesn't depend on what someone else does next. Another breath. Slow. Even. Uninterrupted. And in that breath something becomes clear. This presence isn't reacting to pressure. It's unaffected by it. And that realization, even if it's only partial, begins to alter the dynamic. Because pressure only works when it creates movement. When it causes doubt. When it triggers response. But here, it hasn't done any of that. So now the question changes. It's no longer, how far can this be pushed? It becomes, why isn't this working? And that question introduces hesitation. Just a fraction of a second. But enough. Enough to interrupt rhythm. Enough to break expectation. And when expectation breaks, control shifts. Not visibly. Not in a way that draws attention. But internally. Where decisions are made. Where perception forms. Where outcomes begin. The one who initiated the pressure takes a moment. Not stepping back. Not stepping forward. Just pausing. Reassessing. Because something doesn't add up. The signals aren't matching the situation. There's no sign of fear. But there's also no sign of confrontation. No aggression. No defensiveness. Only calm. Consistent. Unshaken. Complete. And calm in a moment designed for tension. Becomes powerful. Not because it overpowers anything. But because it removes the foundation that tension relies on. Without reaction there's nothing to build on. Without escalation there's nowhere to go. So the energy that was once directed outward has nowhere to land. It lingers, then slowly begins to fade. And this is where the shift fully takes hold. Not in what happens next, but in what doesn't. No sudden movements. No final action. No clear moment that signals an ending. Just a gradual realization that the situation has already changed. Because the need to prove something is no longer there. The space between them remains. But it feels different now. Less like a boundary being tested, and more like an understanding being formed. Unspoken, unforced, but real. And in that understanding, something important becomes visible. Control was never about dominance. It was about stability, the ability to remain unchanged. When everything around you is trying to create change. That's what shifted the moment. Not strength, not speed, not intimidation, but composure. The kind that doesn't rise to meet pressure. And doesn't fall under it either. It simply stays where it is. And in doing so, it changes everything else. Because when one person stops playing the expected role, the entire interaction has to adjust. And adjustment takes time. Time to process. Time to reconsider. Time to step out of assumption. So instead of escalation, there's space. Instead of conflict, there's pause. And in that pause, the outcome is already decided. Not through action, but through understanding that nothing needed to happen for everything to change. And maybe that's the part most people miss. They look for the moment where something happens. The turning point, the visible shift, the clear resolution. But sometimes, the most important changes are the ones you don't see. The ones that happen internally, quietly, completely. And by the time anyone realizes it, the situation has already moved on. Not because someone forced it to, but because there was nothing left to push against. And that is where real control reveals itself. If a moment like this appeared online, most people would see it completely differently. Clipped, edited, compressed into a few seconds. And almost immediately the question would appear. Who won? It's predictable. Because that's how people are used to interpreting situations like this. There has to be a winner. There has to be a loser. There has to be a clear, visible outcome. Something obvious. Something easy to label. But moments like this don't fit into that structure. And that's where misunderstanding begins. Because what people expect to see is action. They look for movement, reaction, escalation, something that confirms their idea of strength. But when none of that happens, it creates confusion. And confusion, especially online, doesn't last long. It gets replaced with assumptions. Some would say, nothing happened. Others might claim, he backed down, or he didn't do anything. And on the surface, it might look that way, because we've been conditioned to associate strength with visibility. If it's not loud, if it's not dramatic, if it doesn't leave a clear mark, we assume it doesn't matter. But that assumption misses something deeper, because not all outcomes are external. Some happen entirely beneath the surface, in perception, in awareness, in decision-making. The moment we just witnessed wasn't about overpowering someone. It wasn't about proving dominance. It wasn't about forcing a result. It was about something far more subtle, not being moved. And that's difficult to capture in a short clip, because stillness doesn't translate easily. Control doesn't look impressive at first glance. Restraint doesn't go viral the way reaction does. So the narrative gets reshaped, simplified, distorted, turned into something it was never meant to be. That's how online interpretation works. It fills in the gaps with expectation. And expectation often comes from habit, from what people have seen before, from what they believe should happen. But here's the problem. This moment doesn't follow those rules. There was no confrontation in the traditional sense. No exchange. No escalation. Just presence. And presence doesn't create a highlight. It creates a shift, one that's easy to overlook, unless you're paying attention. Now imagine watching this again. But instead of asking, who won? Ask a different question. Who stayed in control? Not control over the other person, but control over themselves. Because that's where the real difference lies. One person entered the moment expecting a reaction. The other didn't offer one. And that changes everything. Because when someone expects resistance and doesn't receive it, they're forced to reconsider. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. And internal shifts are rarely visible. They don't make noise. They don't create spectacle. But they matter. A lot. Because they influence what happens next. Whether someone continues or stops. Whether they push further or pause. Whether the situation escalates or dissolves. And in this case, it didn't escalate. Not because it couldn't, but because there was nothing feeding it. That's the part most people miss. They think situations end because someone wins. But often, they end because someone doesn't engage in the expected way. And that breaks the pattern. Online, patterns are everything. Clear roles. Clear outcomes. Clear narratives. Hero versus villain. Strong versus weak. Winner versus loser. But real life, especially moments like this, don't follow those structures. They're more fluid, more complex, more dependent on awareness than action. And that makes them harder to interpret. Which is why people simplify them. Reduce them to something familiar, something easy to understand, even if it's not accurate. So instead of seeing composure, they see inaction. Instead of recognizing control, they see passivity. Instead of understanding restraint, they assume hesitation. But those interpretations say more about the viewer than the moment itself, because what we notice often reflects what we value. If someone values dominance, they'll look for signs of it. If someone values reaction, they'll expect it. But if someone understands discipline, they'll see something completely different. They'll notice the stillness, the awareness, the decision not to escalate. And they'll recognize that as strength. Not the kind that needs validation, but the kind that exists regardless of who's watching. That's what makes moments like this so powerful. Not because they're dramatic, but because they challenge perception. They force you to look beyond the obvious, to question what you think strength looks like, and to consider the possibility that the absence of action is sometimes the most intentional action of all. So the next time you see something like this, don't rush to label it. Don't immediately ask who won. Instead, pause, look a little closer, and ask yourself a better question. What actually happened here? Because the answer might not be what you expect. And understanding that difference is where real awareness begins. Now slow it down, because this is the part most people skip. Not because it isn't important, but because it isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't compete for it. It simply waits. And if you stay with it long enough, something becomes clear. Strength isn't what most people think it is. It's not volume. It's not force. It's not dominance. Those things are easy to display, easy to notice, easy to misunderstand as power. But real strength, the kind that actually holds under pressure, looks very different. It's quiet. It's controlled. And most of the time, it goes unseen. Think about the moment we just explored. Nothing dramatic happened. No clear action. No visible win. And yet, everything changed. Because one person made a decision. Not to react. Not to match energy. Not to be pulled into something unnecessary. That decision is where the lesson begins. Because in everyday life, pressure shows up in different ways. Not always physical. Often emotional. Sometimes verbal. Sometimes silent. A comment that feels personal. A situation that feels unfair. A moment where reacting feels justified. And in those moments, the instinct is immediate. Say something back. Defend yourself. Push back harder. Prove a point. Because that's what most people do. It feels natural. Feels right. But here's the truth. Reaction is easy. Anyone can react. It doesn't require much thought. It doesn't require control. It just happens. But restraint? That's different. That requires awareness. It requires you to pause. Even when everything inside you is telling you not to. It requires you to step back internally. Even when the situation is pushing forward. And that's not weakness. That's discipline. The kind that doesn't depend on who you're dealing with. The kind that stays consistent, no matter what's happening around you. Because discipline isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling your own response. Your tone. Your actions. Your decisions. And that control changes outcomes. Not always instantly. Not always visibly. But consistently. Because when you don't react impulsively, you create space. Space to think. Space to understand. Space to choose a better response. And that space is powerful. It separates instinct from intention. Emotion from clarity. Reaction from decision. Most people don't give themselves that space. They move too quickly. They respond too fast. And then they deal with the consequences later. But what if you didn't? What if, in the next moment of pressure, you did what most people don't? What if you paused, just for a second, long enough to notice your breathing, long enough to recognize what you're feeling, long enough to choose, instead of react? That 1 second can change everything, because it interrupts the pattern, the automatic cycle of stimulus and response. And once that pattern is broken, you're no longer being controlled by the situation. You're participating in it, on your terms. That's what composure really is. Not the absence of feeling, but the ability to manage it, to experience pressure, without being overwhelmed by it, to stay present, without being pulled in different directions, to remain steady, even when things around you are not. And that steadiness builds something over time. Confidence. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that needs to prove itself, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from knowing you can handle pressure without losing control. And once you have that, you don't need to dominate situations. You don't need to win every interaction. You don't need to respond to everything that challenges you. Because you understand something deeper. Not every situation deserves your reaction. Not every comment deserves your energy. Not every moment requires your involvement. And that understanding gives you freedom. Freedom from unnecessary conflict. Freedom from emotional overreaction. Freedom from the need to prove something all the time. That's what makes this lesson so important. It's not about a specific moment. It's not about a specific person. It's about a mindset, a way of moving through pressure, without being defined by it. So think about your own life. Not in extreme situations, just everyday moments. A conversation that starts to turn tense. A disagreement that begins to escalate. A situation where you feel misunderstood. What do you usually do? Do you react immediately? Or do you pause? Do you match the energy in front of you? Or do you stay grounded in your own? Because that choice, even though it feels small, defines more than you think. It shapes how others see you. It influences how situations unfold. And most importantly, it determines how you feel afterward. Calm, clear, in control, or frustrated, overwhelmed, drained. The difference often comes down to one thing: whether you reacted or responded. And that distinction is everything. So the next time you feel pressure rising, don't rush. Don't force an outcome. Don't try to win the moment. Just stay present. Breathe. Observe. And remember, you don't have to react to remain in control. Sometimes, the strongest move you can make is no move at all. And maybe that's the part most people don't expect. Not the silence. Not the stillness. Not even the lack of reaction. But the realization that comes after. Because when everything settles, when the moment passes, when nothing dramatic has happened, you're left with something unusual. Clarity. The kind that doesn't come from action, but from understanding. Because now you can see it differently. What looked like nothing was actually everything. Every decision not to react, every moment of restraint, every second of staying grounded, it all added up to something powerful. Not visible, but real. And that changes how you define strength. Because most people grow up believing strength is about proving something. Proving you're not weak. Proving you can respond. Proving you can stand your ground. And sometimes that belief follows you everywhere. Into conversations. Into disagreements. Into moments that don't actually require anything from you, but still feel like they do. So you react. Not because you need to, but because you feel like you should. Because staying silent feels like losing. Because not responding feels like giving in. Because doing nothing feels like weakness. But what if that belief is wrong? What if strength was never about proving anything in the first place? What if it was about understanding when nothing needs to be proven? That shift in thinking changes everything. Because now, instead of asking, how do I respond to this? You start asking, does this even require a response? And that question alone can save you from so many unnecessary situations. Situations that drain your energy, that pull you into conflict, that leave you feeling like you had to defend something, even when you didn't. Because not every challenge is real. Not every moment of pressure is meaningful. And not every situation deserves your attention. But without awareness, they all feel important. They all feel urgent. They all feel like something you need to engage with. And that's where people lose control. Not because they're weak, but because they're constantly reacting. Constantly pulled into moments that don't actually matter. Constantly giving energy to things that don't deserve it. But once you see it, once you truly understand it, you start to move differently. You pause more. You observe more. You choose more carefully. And that changes your presence. Because now you're not just reacting to what's happening around you. You're deciding how much of it you allow to affect you. And that's where real control begins. Not in dominating situations. Not in winning interactions. But in choosing your level of engagement. Because when you control that, you control everything that follows. Think about it. The strongest person in a room isn't always the loudest. Isn't always the most aggressive. Isn't always the one everyone notices first. Sometimes, it's the one who doesn't need to be noticed at all. The one who stays calm. The one who doesn't get pulled in. The one who understands that presence is more powerful than performance. And that kind of strength doesn't fade. It doesn't depend on the situation. It doesn't rely on outcomes. It stays consistent. Because it comes from within. Not from what's happening outside. That's why moments like this matter. Not because of what happens in them, but because of what they reveal. They show you a different way of handling pressure. A different way of defining strength. A different way of moving through situations that would normally pull you in. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start to recognize it everywhere. In conversations that don't escalate, because someone chose not to react. In situations that dissolve, because someone didn't feed the tension. In moments that pass quietly, because someone understood that nothing needed to happen. And those moments, even though they're easy to overlook, are the ones that shape your life the most. Because they determine how you deal with pressure, how you handle conflict, how you respond to challenges, and ultimately, who you become. So maybe the real takeaway isn't about that moment at all. Maybe it's about you. About how you choose to respond the next time you're tested. Because that moment will come. It always does. In different forms. At different times. But the feeling is the same. Pressure. Expectation. The sense that you need to do something. Say something. Prove something. And when it does, you'll have a choice. React. Or remain. Follow instinct. Or apply awareness. Get pulled in. Or stay grounded. And that choice, even though it happens in seconds, has lasting impact. Because every time you choose composure over reaction, you reinforce it. You strengthen it. You make it easier the next time. And over time, it becomes part of who you are. Not something you think about. Not something you force. Just something you do. Naturally. Effortlessly. Consistently. And that's when you realize, strength was never about the moment itself. It was about how you showed up in it. So maybe the strongest person in the room isn't the one who wins. Isn't the one who dominates. Isn't the one who proves something to everyone else. Maybe it's the one who doesn't need to. The one who understands that control doesn't come from force. It comes from choice. The choice to stay calm. The choice to stay aware. The choice to stay in control. No matter what's happening around you. And once you understand that, you don't just see situations differently. You experience them differently, with less tension, less urgency, less need to react, and more clarity, more confidence, more control, not over others, but over yourself. And in the end, that's what makes all the difference, because the real power in any moment isn't in what you do, it's in what you choose not to do, and that choice is always yours.